Hi, I'm Ryan Moody. Thank you so much for joining me today. We're continuing in our series on the book of Romans. This is our third lesson. We talked about in the first lesson about Romans 1 verse 16. Paul said, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ," and how the book of Romans is Paul's explanation of the gospel that Christ preached. If we want to understand the gospel by which we're saved that Christ preached, we've got to understand the book of Romans, because this is what Romans is about. It is explaining the gospel in detail. And last lesson we talked about in verse 17, the just shall live by faithfulness. It's not faith, it's faithfulness. And live there means eternal life. So it's saying the just, or the righteous person, the person who's living righteously, is going to have eternal life by their faithfulness to God. So today we're going to continue through chapter 1. We might just cover chapter 1 entirely, but what we want to do first is establish the fact of the context of what chapter 1 is talking about. Who are the subjects of chapter 1? So, for example, when you go down to verse 21, it says, because that when they knew God, well, who are they? Well, the only people who knew God, which was God's people, the Israelites. They're the only people who knew God. They're the only ones God had revealed himself to. Excuse me. And so this chapter is talking about God's people, and we've got to understand that to understand what's being said here by Paul. And so we've got to recognize that. Some other indicators here that it's talking about God's people. For example, in verse 23, it mentions them going into idolatry and worshiping animals and birds and four-footed beasts and so forth. Then there's a couple of statements made that are reminiscent or echoing what was said in the Old Testament about God's people. For example, in verse 24, it says, "Wherefore God also gave them up." And in verse 26, "For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections." Well, going back into the Psalm 81, and starting in verse 11, it says, "But my people," so talking about God's people, "my people would not hearken to my voice, and Israel would none of me. So I gave them up unto their own heart's lusts." Well, that's exactly what he's saying in Romans. God gave them up to vile affections, to their own heart's lusts, and they walked in their own counsels. Oh, that my people had hearkened unto me, and Israel had walked in my ways. Another statement is made in Acts chapter 7, and this is when Stephen was preaching just before he was stoned to death. In Acts 7 verse 42, he says, "Then God turned and gave them up to worship the host of heaven." So again, talking about idolatry, which is what he's saying in Romans chapter 1. So it's imperative that we get the subjects right in this chapter to be able to understand what Paul is saying. So he's not just talking about people in general, he's talking specifically about God's people in this chapter. So now in verse 18 it says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold or suppress the truth in unrighteousness." Now this is talking about some specific events, two events in particular, that were recorded in Israel's scriptures, in the very first book of the Bible, in the book of Genesis. One is the flood, where rain came down from heaven. God's wrath came down from heaven and destroyed all life except for 8 people that were on the ark. And the second event in particular was the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, where the fire from God came down from heaven and destroyed all these ungodly cities where they were committing mainly sexual sins. And then there could be some other events that would fit in here as well, like for example in the Exodus, when God was pouring out the different plagues upon Egypt. One of them was hailstones, or hailstones came down from heaven. And so it can refer to other events as well, but it's mainly those two events, the flood and the fire and brimstone on Sodom and Gomorrah. So it's saying that God's wrath is revealed to them. So God's people knew what his will was, what he thought about homosexuality, because he destroyed those cities that were living in that sin. And so they didn't have any excuse for that. They knew what God's will was about that. Then in verse 19 it says, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has showed it unto them. And then in verse 20 is a somewhat familiar verse to a lot of people. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Now, a lot of preachers will use this verse to say something it's really not saying. And one thing they'll use it for is to say, oh, the creation proves there's a creator. Well, there's some truth to that, sure. You can't have a creation without a creator, and they'll use that as proof that God exists. Well, then other preachers take this a step further, and they say that the creation is actually a way that the gospel is preached to people all around the world. They'll say, in order to answer the question, well, what happens to these people who've never heard the gospel? People in these far countries, and they don't have scriptures, there's no preachers, how can they get saved or not? And they'll say, oh yeah, they have the opportunity to get saved. They can hear the gospel through the creation. The creation reveals God, and if they'll listen to the creation and they'll draw toward it, and whatever it is they preach about, they claim that people can get saved by just looking at the creation. The creation gives them faith to be saved or something. That is not what Paul is saying here. He's not saying that. He's talking about God's people. He's not talking about all people in general. He's talking about God's people. And he's saying that the creation itself leaves God's people without excuse. It says, that's the last thing it says, so that they are without excuse. And what that means is the creation account itself in Genesis, in the first 2 chapters of Genesis, particularly the creation of man and his wife, left Israel without excuse when it came to the sexual sins that God's people were into. Because see, we saw in verse 26, God gave them up to vile affections, the lusts of their own hearts, different sexual sins. Well, the creation left them without excuse because they know God's will. He created man and he created the woman to be the wife of one man. It was one man and one woman to be married for life. And that was the only place for sexuality, is in the marriage between a man and a woman. And so because of that, the creation left them without excuse for the sins that they eventually became engaged in. But looking down in verse 23, it says, they changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like unto corruptible man, and to birds, and to four-footed beasts, and creeping things. See, the things that God had created. Those are the animals that God created in the creation account, and yet God's people were worshiping the animals as though they were gods. In fact, go down to verse 25, it says, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature or the creation more than the creator, who's blessed forever. Amen. So that's what he's saying, is that the creation left them without excuse. For them to be worshiping animals, to be worshiping the sun and the moon and whatever else they were worshiping, they had no excuse for that, because they knew from their scriptures that those were just simply things that God himself had created, and God was the one they were to worship. So now, moving down to verse 26, so he says, for this cause God gave them up unto vile affections, for even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. Now, most people, when they read this, they think, well, this is talking about lesbianism, and it may very well be included in that. But in the Old Testament scriptures, there really aren't any accounts of God's people engaging in that. I'm sure that happened, but we don't have any accounts of that. What he's really talking about, Paul's really talking about, is the women getting into prostitution. There was just all kinds of harlotry and prostitution going on among God's people. And it's saying that the women were changing the natural use, natural meaning how they were created. See, the creation left them without excuse. They knew what the woman had been created for. And yet, so women were changing that natural use, the created use, into that which is against nature. They were having all kinds of sex outside of marriage, and they had no excuse for that. And then in verse 27, and likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, so the natural created use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error, which was meat. So now here he's talking about homosexuality, and how God's people had gotten into homosexuality, and they were without excuse for doing that, because the creation taught them about how sexuality was supposed to be. But Paul is actually even talking about a specific event that happened in Israel's history. So if we go back to the book of Judges, and this is right toward the end of the book of Judges, last couple of chapters, there was an event that happened in Israel that just almost mirrors exactly what happened back in Sodom and Gomorrah. In fact, when you read this, it's as though you're reading the account of what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah, but it's not. It's a completely separate event, but it's almost exactly the same thing happened. And so it says here, and this is in Judges chapter 19, and coincidentally, Sodom and Gomorrah is back in Genesis 19. Well, this is Judges 19, and verse 22. Now as they were making their hearts merry, behold, the men of the city, certain sons of Belial, beset the house round about, and beat at the door, and spake to the master of the house and the old man, saying, Bring forth the man that came into thine house, that we may know him. And the master of the house, went out unto them, and said to them, Nay, my brethren, nay, I pray you, do not so wickedly, seeing this man is come into mine house. Do not do this folly, and so forth. What ended up happening is this man sent his concubine, a lady, out to them, and it says that they abused her all night, and she ended up dying. And he got up the next morning, and she was dead at his doorstep. And then it says that he then cut her up into 12 pieces, and then sent each piece of her body to a different tribe of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel. And it says in that last verse of chapter 19, It was so that all that saw it said, There was no such deed done, nor seen from the day that the children of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt unto this day. Consider it, take advice, and speak your mind. So this was just a horrible thing that happened. But again, Israel was without excuse, because as Paul said back in Romans 1:18, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven. They knew what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. They knew the fire that came down and destroyed them. And yet they had become so depraved into homosexuality here that they actually were guilty of the same thing. So then, just going on, I'm not going to read here, but going into chapter 20 of of the book of Judges, chapter 20 of the book of Judges, what ends up happening is this event happened in the land of Benjamin. And so all the other tribes now go to the leaders of Benjamin and say, bring these ungodly men out to us, give them to us. But Benjamin wouldn't. Benjamin was harboring them and keeping them there, and would not give them up to face justice and be judged and eventually to be put to death. They wouldn't do that. So the other tribes then went to God in prayer and said, "What should we do?" And God told them to attack Benjamin, and they did. So in short, they ended up attacking Benjamin. It went back and forth. There were casualties on both sides. But what ended up happening, Benjamin was almost nearly destroyed completely. They were just down to a few hundred men. I think it was something like maybe 600 men survived out of the entire tribe of Benjamin. But out of those 600 men, you know, God told Israel to stop there, leave these 600 men, and then that tribe of Benjamin then was reproduced out of those 600 men. But so here's the point. That event that happened in the book of Judges, in God's people, in their history, that's what he's talking about here in verse 27. It says, "Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which is meet." See, the recompense that they received was death. They were attacked and they were killed down to just a few hundred men that were left. So they received in themselves the recompense of their error, which was meet, which was fitting, which was just. That was fitting for them. So as you read on down in here, and we read down further, going down to the last verse here, the last verse of Romans chapter 1, it says, "Who knowing the judgment of God," and see, that's what he's saying. God's people, they knew the judgment of God. They knew God's judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah, the fire that came down from heaven. Knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death. Which that's what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. Then it says, "Not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them." Well, the old King James here kind of makes it a little difficult to understand, having pleasure in them that do them. The New King James says that they approve of those that do them. So that makes it clear what he's saying. What Paul is saying is that it's not only people who are committing those sin and practicing those sins that are guilty of death before God, but it's saying that those that approve of what they're doing, they may not be practicing it themselves, but if they approve of what they're doing, and like that's what Benjamin was doing. Benjamin was harboring those men and approving of what they were doing by keeping them safe, keeping justice from coming to those men. Then that tribe of Benjamin were just as guilty. They were just as guilty before God as if they themselves were committing that sin. That's what he's saying here. So it's not only those that practice these things, but those that approve of those that practice those things. They're just as guilty of death. And that was seen in the scriptures. It was seen in God not only destroying the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, but it was seen in the book of Judges, where God destroyed almost the entire tribe of Benjamin because they were approving of those practices. The Benjamin wasn't even practicing those things, but they were approving of those and siding with those that were practicing it, and it made them just as guilty. And that principle is true for us, that if we agree with things that God calls sin, we're just as guilty as if we're practicing those things ourselves. If we are siding against God in what He said is sin, then we're on the other side. We belong to those who are guilty of practicing those things. We're considered just as guilty as if we ourselves are practicing them. So Paul is telling us, and he's using God's people to say all this, but the point to us is we have to agree with God. We have to agree with God's judgment and what God calls sin, and we have to agree with Him about it. We're not the judges. We agree with God and His judgment. It's His judgment that we agree with, and if we do that, then we're not guilty of that. We are siding with Him and His judgment. And again, this goes back to Paul was not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. That is the gospel of Christ. That is part of the gospel that Christ preached. That God's people knew what His will was, and that for them to go against His will, they were guilty and they had no excuse for it. So we'll leave that there today and pick up the next lesson in chapter 2 next time. So thank you for joining me. And again, if you want to get a hold of me, my contact is on my website. It is www.understandingscripture, all one word, understandingscripture.net. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time.